All right, thank you. Thanks for having us. It's always a pleasure to be part of UVU Ethics Week. This is a long-standing tradition at UVU, and we're always glad to be a part of it. My name is Ryan Vogel. I'm the director of the Center for National Security Studies here at UVU. We have Dr. Greg Jackson as well, who's the deputy director and a professor at Integrated Studies. And our topic is on the withdrawals, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria withdrawals. We're going to talk about some of the ethical considerations. And before we do that, we're going to talk a little bit about some history and put kind of the landscape there. Our plan is to each deliver a few minutes of remarks just to kind of set the table, and then we'll be happy to entertain questions and have more of a discussion. And so just so we're on the same page at the beginning, what we're looking at is the United States has been in armed conflicts for the past 20 years in the post 9/11 environment. Afghanistan started shortly after 9/11 with the September 17th of 2001 authorization for use of military force against the perpetrators of 9/11 and those that harbored them. And that was read to mean Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So shortly after that, we have an invasion in Afghanistan, and we spend the next 20 years there. Of course, as everyone's aware, just in the last month or so, we've seen the US withdraw forces from Afghanistan. And that's prompted a whole lot of questions, which we'll talk about in just a minute, about the strategic and operational, geopolitical kinds of concerns and challenges that come from that withdrawal. But that's just the third withdrawal that we've seen from the United States over the past 10 years. In 2011, we withdrew from Iraq. This was a campaign promise from President Obama that he would end the wars that the United States was in. And so in 2011, we withdraw from a conflict that we had been in since 2003 in Iraq. Well, shortly after that, we go back into Iraq to fight ISIS. That's both in Syria and Iraq. And in 2019, President Trump withdraws US forces from Syria in a conflict where we had allies, we had partners on the ground, and there's some implications there. And then, of course, Afghanistan. So these are this is the context that we're going to be talking about today. And as I said, Dr. Jackson, historian that he is going to be covering the backdrop, and then we'll go from there.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Ryan. So that backdrop, to make clear how to best conceive and understand this region, even as we're talking post 9/11, really we need to be talking post World War I or simply World War I. The Middle East, and it always depends on which map you're looking at as to whether or not Afghanistan gets included as more Central Asia versus the Middle East. But to understand all of this, you have to know what happened in World War I. It isn't just a European conflict. It is truly a global conflict, in part because of the way the rest of the world gets sucked into this thing. So as the war comes to its end, as Germany and Austria lose, we often forget that the Ottoman Empire was a third piece of that alliance. And it created the opportunity for the British and the French to kind of be able to carve up some of the territory that the Ottomans held, that both of those large empires were interested in. So throughout World War I, the British had an expeditionary force that advanced, departed from India, and apparently I'm going to move my hand around as though I have a map in front of me, which I don't, but moved up, along basically the Tigris River in what was then known as Mesopotamia, through Ottoman-controlled Middle East. And as they were doing so, as they were advancing, the British and the French were working out a secret agreement known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Now that became public during the war. The Russians, as they had a revolution and withdrew from the war, and their alliance with the British and French spilled the beans. And it did not go into effect. But when the League of Nations is created after World War I, one of the things that the League of Nations is charged with doing is basically mentoring, or at least so the language is on paper, mentoring new states in the formerly controlled Ottoman Empire. And so within that context, Britain and France, both of whom have a lot of say and control in the League of Nations as it's coming together, this new international entity that Woodrow Wilson called for, but then did not succeed at getting the United States to join. these mandates are created, and they draw the map. Iraq, its borders today, they were drawn mostly by really smart Brits who nonetheless were interested in Britain's interests far more so than the locals' interests. Syria, its borders are drawn at this time as well. And Syria is an ancient term that's been used all the way back to the Romans, but having a defined border, all of this was new. So when we're talking about Iraq and Syria, we have to understand that these are, as they're conceived today as nation states, they are born in World War I, and they're handed to Britain and France. The Syrians, as they're now being dubbed, they said to the League of Nations, we do not need mentoring. We can handle self-governance. If you do hand us to someone, I think this is interesting and worth noting for our conversation today. If you do hand us to someone, please hand us to the United States so we can talk about how and why views may have shifted there in the century since. They said, if not the Americans, the Brits, if not the Brits, anyone but the French. The League of Nations handed them to the French. Iraq, of course, went to the British. And so that's where we get these borders, everything from discussions about whether or not there should be an independent Kurdistan or not. These were discussions that were had after World War I, as the maps are being drawn through the League of Nations and primarily by the French and the British. Now, as for Afghanistan, there was impact during building up to World War I and afterward. There was this era going in back to the 1800s, in fact, known as the Great Game. As Russia's empire was descending, the British Empire was ascending in terms of north and south. The British coming up from India, the Russians expanding further southward. And Afghanistan, what was then known as Persia, today known as Iran, it was all caught in between these two massive empires who didn't end up in a hot war between one another, but as they kind of played, to use that verb, for control of the region, that's where the term the Great Game emerged. Afghanistan there was an attempt by the British to take it several times. By the time we get into the 1920s, we had the third British-Afghan War. The British lost this, as many people know, as they talk about Afghanistan, the kind of statement of empires kind of going there to die. So that was when the British last lost. Afghanistan itself wasn't recognized as a nation state until 1934. There's still some problematics with even calling it that. Some might argue to this day. So I think the key thing, because I also will try to keep this to the 10 minutes we talked about, is to note that Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, these nation states as we conceive of them, all of them are really very modern creations. And the governance that they've had in that century since has largely grown out of their experience coming out of World War I. Syria continued to be controlled by the French into the 1940s, and then ended up with strongman dictators, essentially the Assad family. In Iraq, they went through some quick-moving monarchies, and then had a few revolutions that ended up with the Ba'athist Party in power and ultimately Saddam Hussein. And then, of course, in Afghanistan, there were a few changes in governance, some alliances at times with the USSR during the era of Khrushchev, for instance. And then later, the Russians decided that Afghanistan wasn't sufficiently in their pocket. And so the Russians themselves also went in, or rather, I should say the Soviets went in and tried to solidify control there around the 80s. And of course, they failed as well. And in the wake of that, we had more of what we would call today extremist groups that started to emerge. And that's where we start to see the Taliban and Al-Qaeda coming together in Afghanistan. I think I'll stop there, though. Sufficient background?
Yeah, that's okay. Great. And that brings us to the point where the United States is fighting these wars for strategic interests, and in some cases in response to attacks that were levied against the United States as well. There are some strategic and operational considerations that jump out, and that's not really the focus of what we're doing today. But just to kind of make you aware of some of the things that we'd be thinking about, were the wars continuing to accomplish strategic objectives for the United States? It was a counterterrorism platform, right? But in all three areas. you had a counterterrorism platform, you had a base in the region in which to stage operations or project power. And so all those added value for the United States. Of course, there were also drawbacks. The wars were costing a lot of money. They were costing American lives. And other strategic interests were being sort of avoided or interrupted, like our focus on peer competitors and that kind of thing. By withdrawing in all three instances, but probably more in Afghanistan than any other, we risked losing the faith of our allies and future partners. We risked China and Russia exploiting our absence. We risked just the specter of loss, right? That the United States, similar to post-Vietnam, was seen as a loser on the international stage, losing kind of that aura of invincibility. There are, of course, counterterrorism issues that come from leaving a region where these terrorist organizations organize, lose that base of operation, and the ability to promote values and project power. All of those things are operational and strategic concerns that came with withdrawing. But as I said, the focus of our discussion is more on the ethical and moral considerations of withdrawing from conflicts. Like I said before, there are pros and cons that we have to consider here. And I'm actually going to prompt more questions for the group than answer them, which is a nice punt by me on that. But hopefully some of the discussion can elicit some answers here. We talk about saving American lives by withdrawing, and that certainly will be the case. Although, to be fair on the context that existed in Afghanistan, there were not a lot of combat casualties in Afghanistan in the last 5 years or so. So that wasn't happening in the immediate situation in Afghanistan before we withdraw, and that was similar with some of the other conflicts that we've withdrawn from as well. We have to ask ourselves, in terms of ethical and moral considerations, are we risking a reversal on the investment or the progress that we've made in these countries? The frustration is that, and you heard this from a lot of people, including President Biden, that the Afghans were not invested enough in their own progress for us to justify staying there. But the immediate reversal, are we ethically obligated there? Do we have moral responsibility there? Are there costs that can we use money? Can we use the funds that we're using for wars in a more responsible way for our society? That goes on the other side of the scale. Does ending these wars relieve some of the strain on our political system, some of the strain on our military, some of the strain on the legal system? Certainly, as many of you will know, a lot of powers are triggered by wartime, right? The president is more powerful, the executive branch is more powerful, the federal government is more powerful in wartime. And if that goes on in perpetuity, decade after decade, there's a strain. And in some ways, there's an irreversible effect that is put on American political and legal society that has to be considered. So withdrawing may ease those kinds of tensions. But do we have an obligation to the host country? If we have an obligation, this is, Colin Powell told President George W. Bush around the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003, hey, there's the Pottery Barn rule applies here, which is if you break it, it's yours, right? Well, I think we can make the case that, we had a hand in breaking a lot of things in the countries that we were fighting in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan. Does that involve some kind of a moral responsibility? Are we required to fix it before we turn it back over? Or are we required to have some kind of good faith effort at helping them fix it before we move on? I think that's an open question. I think that's something that would be interesting to discuss. Do we have an obligation? Is there an obligation as for the United States as a superpower, as a powerful country, and as a country that is involved in the enforcement of international rules, to continue with the project that it started? Do we owe a responsibility to the region? Do we owe a responsibility to the world in that way? There's a lot of discussion around the withdrawal of Afghanistan about nation building and state building and that kind of thing. Is that something that we bring upon ourselves as a responsibility because of the actions that we take that precipitate that? If we are staying in a country that would require an increased investment, how does that factor in? So let's say the argument for withdrawing from any of these conflicts is that the status quo doesn't hold anymore, right? So I just mentioned that in Afghanistan, we had not seen a lot of combat casualties in the last 5 years. In fact, the United States was not really in a forward operating position aside from air power in the last 4 or 5 years in Afghanistan. But let's say that couldn't be sustained with the presence that we had there, 4,000 troops. What if in order to keep the status quo, we had to do 10,000 troops? Does that factor in to the ethical and moral consideration? How do we balance the harm of staying versus the harm of leaving? Look, anytime you're in an armed conflict, there's going to be harm, right? That we know that. But is the harm of leaving and reversing the situation that we've created, which hopefully is better than the situation before, is there a obligation there? And then lastly, and there will be other questions, and I think I'm seeing some come in on the chat here. Does our leaving benefit bad actors in the country or region? If we leave, so in 2011 we left, and it led almost immediately to the rise of ISIS. In 2021 we leave Afghanistan, it leads almost immediately to the rise of the Taliban, or the re-rise of the Taliban. In 2019, the Kurdish allies that we had in the region are immediately harmed by ISIS and other bad actors in the region. If we leave and we know that there's going to be immediate negative results and that bad actors will benefit from our withdrawal, does that factor into the moral and ethical calculus that we have to do before we make those decisions? Like I said at the beginning of my comments here, we have to consider strategy, we have to consider operations, we have to consider internal issues with politics and with legal issues. But on the ethical and moral side, how do we square our actions that came before, during the armed conflict, and even before that, with withdrawing in a situation where the aftermath may be worse than it was before? And so I'll leave it at that, and we'll look at some of these questions and start to answer those.
All right, let's see.
So this first one, how do you see the impact of these withdrawals and the debates surrounding them on American civil society, and specifically our ability to unify as a nation in response to American use of force around the world? I think that's a really good question, and it's a very difficult question. There's usually more unity around going into conflict than withdrawing from conflict. I mean, for those of you that were that were aware of things after 9/11, there was a tremendous amount of unity surrounding the kind of post 9/11 environment. That same situation did not exist in Iraq, by the way. So going into Iraq, there was actually quite a bit of division, even though there was significant political unity. The AUMF for Iraq was passed with overwhelming numbers. But there was more division on that point than 9/11. But withdrawing from conflict, you're going to have winners, you're going to have losers. Of course, the other political side is going to point to the failings, and that's going to create more division.
I would also compare this, and I'm by far not the first to do so, that this isn't terribly original, but to our withdrawal from Vietnam. There's nothing about that I would look at and say anyone in America felt warm and fuzzy about or unifying on. I mean, withdrawing from a military operation that's gone sour, regardless of what the original intent was in going in, or whether all parties in the U.S. agreed about going in or not, it leaves a foul taste. So the same thing is happening here. I think another interesting consideration is the layering, where the United States, coming out of, say, World War I and World War II, had this real narrative of essentially winning, of being, and not just winning in terms of militarily being the one that came out on top, but winning in a moral way, in being on, the right side, if you will. And I would say that as we look at Vietnam and now the legacy of what's been playing out post 9/11, there's a lot more ambiguity as to, debating, as we are right in this very moment. What was the ethical thing to do? Were we even right to go into some of these situations once we went in? Was it right to stay? Should we have stayed there because of things that developed on the ground, in addition to the original rationale for going in? So this is now becoming something of an ongoing legacy. It makes Vietnam less of an outlier and more something that I think historians might point to and say, this is a phase of American history of withdrawals and questions and ambiguities that disrupt and make American society uncomfortable.
Yeah, and to go to Dr. Jackson's point about World War II in comparison and those conflicts compared to where we are in the post-Vietnam space, and I think this goes to the second question. One of the things that we took very seriously after World War II was protecting our investment. So you saw that we had the Marshall Plan, and we also had basing agreements in the countries that we had fought in order to kind of continue the peace. So we've been in Germany for 70 years with basing. We actually occupied that country for years after the war as well, in order to keep the investment that we had made, a tremendous investment during World War II in terms of lives and treasure. And we wanted to make sure that, the outcome was what we wanted it to be. That has not really translated into our modern armed conflicts. We've been in countries and then there's an itch to get out instead of maintaining some kind of a residual force that can keep the peace, keep the investment. And it's an interesting thing. Apparently, our leaders have thought that that's not in our strategic interest to stay in those countries indefinitely, as we did in Korea and Japan and Germany after the wars in the 40s and 50s. So that I think definitely does factor in. Let's see what the third question is here. What are some of the impacts that the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan has had or might have on the nations that share their immediate borders with Afghanistan? You want to take that?
Sure. I'll always start and you jump in. I think the biggest and most pressing and interesting, perhaps even frightening will be the adjective I'll go for, is the budding relationship between the Taliban and China. It appears that those are two entities that, while on paper, certainly should not be really getting along. I mean, there's some real irony with, China's atrocious actions, frankly, against the Uyghur population at present. To see the Chinese government in talks with the Taliban, and yet, in the very realpolitik sort of way, the two are certainly working out how to be mutually beneficial moving forward. So I think that we see the vacuum that's being created as the U.S. withdraws, and one of the considerations that we should have on withdrawal, among the many factors, is when the U.S. withdraws, is it like pulling a knife from a wound, which of course ultimately you always want to get the knife out, but the timing of pulling that knife out could also mean the death of the injured person as opposed to their recovery. How do we feel, and what are our thoughts on having China step in to that vacuum to basically be the new heavy? That's the number one thing weighing on my mind.
You didn't ask this, but in the other sphere, Iraq and Syria, of course, when you talk about borders, the big issue is always going to be the Kurds, because they've been agitating for years, and Dr. Jackson set this up perfectly when he talked about the post-World War I environment with Sykes-Picot, and the drawing of borders. One of the groups that was excluded from states, from having a state of their own, was the Kurds in Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. And so that's always going to be a point of tension. And it certainly was here, because the Kurds were probably our best allies in the last 20 years, and in a lot of ways, I think, generated some goodwill from the United States in carving up some kind of territory, whether it's autonomous, whether it's some kind of self-governing structure, or even outright statehood. That will continue to be a discussion going forward.
Well, and if one thing I could just piggyback onto that is that, it's not like the Kurds are not aware of how close they came to being recognized at various times. I mean, I've sat in the Churchill archives in Cambridge and looked at the documents from the Cairo conference in 1921 when the British literally drew the map of Iraq. One of the jokes among Middle Eastern historians is Churchill's sneeze, a jutting out part of Iraq's geography. And the joke is that the straight line has that little jet. I mean, it's a dark humor joke, to be very clear, because when you laugh, you cry less. And, the joke is that as Churchill was drawing the line, he sneezed. And that's why the borders are what they are, to kind of really demonstrate the power that the British government had in designing modern day Iraq. And one of the things, as I'm sitting there looking at this document, on their list of 5 things to consider, one of them was, should we create a Kurdistan? Because that was within their power and purview. And clearly, at the end of the day, as brilliant as many of the people in that room were, that these are some of the top minds of the early 20th century, the interests of Great Britain, of the British Empire, superseded other considerations. Now, the one other thing I'll add to that, because I just think this is good and careful history, is that sometimes we can romanticize what would have been. And I'm not saying that we would have an even worse scenario were there a Kurdistan, but we should also just keep in mind that we don't actually know, what happens if someone went through that alternate door 100 years ago. But we would have a different map in a lot of different places we could follow that. Yeah.
Fourth question, can you give some examples of positive progress brought about by our presence in Afghanistan? So I'll give you one for Afghanistan and one for Iraq. In Afghanistan, it was the progress for women and girls, right? I mean, that's the obvious one, that we saw a significant improvement, and which we'll see significant retraction.
And we've already seen that. I mean, right at this moment, women have been kicked out of universities, told that they cannot come back until there is an appropriate, how do they frame it? It's a sufficiently Islamic culture, I believe, is what the Taliban said. And we've seen bodies hanging in squares already as warnings. So sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, that was, I think, our major point of progress, and it's an immediate retraction, and that's really sad. That we had brought about that positive change in Iraq. I think that the big positive development was the elimination of Saddam Hussein and the Ba'athist regime, right? They were a threat to their own people. They were a threat to the region. A lot of people forget, because of the controversy about going into Iraq, but Iraq was a menace in their region of the world. They did not follow the no-fly zone rules. They starved their own people with the sanctions. They gassed their own people in the north. I mean, they were a menace in their country and in the region. And ridding ourselves of Saddam Hussein and his regime is certainly a positive development, even though, you had a great period of instability in the immediate aftermath. I think Iraq, as opposed to Afghanistan, where Iraq is more modernized and has more of a sense of statehood and government there, has a brighter future, even though there are lots of challenges and still, probably some messiness ahead of them. I think there is more brightness ahead of them than, Afghanistan or Syria.
I'll just add to that. When I was a PhD student, one of my minor fields, I had minor field in the Middle East, and my primary professor, he was the world's foremost historian of Iraq. Peter Sluglet just passed away a few years ago. And his very honest opinion was that for both us and the UK, he said we should have been honest about why we went in. Weapons of mass destruction was not, in his opinion, why we went in. But getting rid of Saddam Hussein was absolutely the right thing to do. So for him, going in was correct. Being disingenuous on the reason for doing so was the problematic side.
Yeah. Question 5, how do we balance and prioritize metrics of war? For example, you brought up U.S. troop casualties several times. What other metrics of harm success should we take into account when making decisions about armed conflicts, such as Afghan troop or civilian deaths? That's a great question. And it's a really complicated question because ultimately we're trying to decide whether something meets our strategic interests. And that's a multifaceted analysis. Is our presence in the region promoting U.S. interests across the board? Are we securing things that are important to us? And that could be everything from energy sources to influence across the world to shoring up alliances and also eliminating threats. And ultimately, that is the reason we went into Afghanistan, was to eliminate threats, terrorist threats from attacking us in the future. At the same time, you have to add all those pieces on the other side. So yes, we're concerned with how much money we're spending in these war zones, how many lives we're losing in these war zones. On the opposite side, we're of course very concerned with how many, especially civilian casualties, we incur for both humanitarian purposes, but also for strategic concerns. If we are killing civilians in a battlefield, not only are we doing what Dr. Jackson said, but by saying or not feeling like we're really on the right side, but we're also making more enemies. We used to talk about in the counterterrorism contest that you can't kill yourself out of this conflict. That's where a lot of the counterinsurgency doctrine came from. That at some point you had to win hearts and minds. You had to show people that you actually cared about them and their survival and their future, or else you were just going to be countering the next generation of terrorist threats with which each activity or each operation. So all those things kind of factor in. It's really hard to answer that question really succinctly, but there's a lot of things that go into those metrics.
And I would also add to that, this is both a legal and an ethical consideration, independent of the legal nature. What is the moral thing to do? Because we can talk about we're saving American lives. Okay, what if we're saving 100 American lives over the course of the next 2 years, and at the same process, we're costing the lives of thousands of young women in Afghanistan? Does the U.S. government have a higher priority? Should it be prioritizing 100 American lives over
generation?
Over generational impact and thousands of Afghan girls and women dying? Where is the obligation of the U.S. government, and what is the more moral or ethical thing to do? Within history, we often are very good at, in hindsight, sitting in chairs and pointing out when a great power overreached and when a great power didn't do. I've heard Bill Clinton lament that we didn't go into Rwanda. That's one of his greatest regrets. I couldn't imagine making these sorts of decisions in real time. I don't say that as either a compliment or as an insult towards President Clinton, but to realize that it isn't easy. It is very hard to decide when you're the 800-pound gorilla and you're trying to do things in an ethical and moral way. And we hope that we are as a nation. When do you throw your weight around on the global stage, and when do you not? And often, successive generations certainly feel that they know and that it was clear at the time, but it usually isn't clear at the time.
Yeah. What gains have China and Russia made with our attention turned to the Middle East, Afghanistan for the past 20 years? That is a great question. And man, it is hard to overstate how much progress, especially China, has made over the last 20 years. I think that our other adversaries or competitors saw the massive amount of investment and focus we were putting on the Middle East, and they really took advantage of it. When you look at China's trajectory, especially post 2007, 2008, when they really seized on that, distractedness, they've made exponential increases in military power, in cultural power, in economic power. They have risen from, one of those states that we were focused on and that we were looking at. I remember working at the Pentagon on the long-term China strategy desk in 2007, 2006. And we underestimated in every way where they would be in 2020. In every way, they've made massive increases in power over the last 20 years. That has to be a factor as well, right? I mean, that in terms of considering what kinds of things the United States takes on, that has to be a factor. It is exactly what Dr. Jackson was just saying, which is, it's easy 10, 20 years down the road to say, oh, we should have done this back then. We're at that moment. In fact, we were at that moment 10 years ago or even longer, where, if we don't do something more proactively against China, we might in 10 or 20 years look back and say, we should have invested more in that rather than this back then. And, there is a bit of zero sum here when it comes to resourcing. And so if you're resourcing heavily for wars in the Middle East that have less strategic value or impact and less on, the peer competition with China, which has more strategic value and impact, that also has ethical and moral implications to it.
Professor Vogel's crushed it with China, so I'll leave that alone. But I'll hit the B-lister, which is Russia. No offense there, but Russia's they're JV at this point. That's how it is. But Russia has made some serious progress. This is outside of one of the nations that we specifically are bringing up here today. But Putin has become buddy with Erdogan, who runs Turkey. We've seen the nation of Turkey go from being a vibrant example of democracy, being absolutely functional in an Islamic, predominantly Muslim nation, as it's gone from being a secular democracy that just happened to have a predominantly Muslim population to really flipping under Erdogan after a century of being that, of being a secular bastion of democracy. And now we're in this very awkward position where we have Turkey, a NATO ally, and you don't want to disrupt NATO. We have a NATO ally with whom we're supposed to share resources, to some degree intelligence, that is buying armaments from Russia. And the Syrian civil war, to now connect there, oh my goodness, I mean, it's just a quagmire where this is both a political, old-fashioned civil war, it's also sectarian war, and it's a proxy war in which we are on the opposite side of Russia dealing with Syria, and Turkey, who is our NATO ally and alleged friend, is buying armaments from Russia and has some shared interests in the way Syria turns out. So Syria has become an absolute Gordian knot, very much to Russia's advantage, and I would say to our disadvantage in terms of the Middle East.
Absolutely. All right, next question. Given the massive amount of resources poured into our invasion efforts, is there a sunk cost component to our attitudes about Afghanistan? Definitely, definitely. I think once you invest heavily into something, you want to see it succeed, and there are points where you even invest more to your own detriment. I think that could be true for Afghanistan. I think what we have to consider there are all of all the issues surrounding a presence in Afghanistan, and decide, well, I think we should have decided what's the level that would make the most sense. If we can accomplish what we need to accomplish there and forestall, the return of the Taliban and all those, destabilizing kinds of things, with the presence of 4,000 or 5,000 that are not in a combat, orientation, that might be worth it. That might be worth the investment. If you're talking about 40, 50,000, 100,000 troops that are, in regular combat operations, that's a totally different ballgame. So that's just not where we were in Afghanistan. Yep. And it's not really where we were in Iraq in 2011. Well, and so that matters.
If forgive me, hoping not stepping on you here. I mean, it's really, to have maintained a force like that wouldn't be that different from our having troops in, say, South Korea right now. But that apparently doesn't bother the American society. We're not up in arms about having troops in South Korea. We're not up in arms about our mini bases and roles across Europe. Why are Americans not leaping up and down that we have forces at this moment in the Baltic states and places like Estonia? And I don't say that to say that we shouldn't be, but to point out our inconsistencies. Yeah. So if we're upset about having 4,000 troops in Afghanistan, where is that same angst where you know, we have those same troops in perhaps more, I'm not going to call the DMZ and Korea a more stable situation per se, but there are other places that are more stable where we have troops and no one's batting an eye.
Well, and this goes back to a discussion that we had last week during National Security Week, which was that part of the responsibility is on our leaders to communicate honestly what we're doing in certain parts of the world. Calling the situation that we were in Afghanistan a war is probably not the right way of communicating to the American public what we were actually doing there.
Mm-hmm.
It was probably more similar to what we're doing in Korea or in other areas where we have a presence and a stabilizing presence in order to, push off armed conflict. I think that would make a difference. I think the American public, you've heard these numbers, but they were 70% in support of withdrawing from Afghanistan. But I think if you are honest with them and tell them what we're doing there and the level of our presence and what those forces are doing, I think those numbers change, and I think that matters. So I think that's part of it. There's no one. I don't think there's no American that thinks that we're fighting a hot war in Korea right now, because we've communicated that well. If we did the same thing in Afghanistan, would the American public be more ready to accept a more long-lasting but similar kind of arrangement?
And if I could play devil's advocate just a little bit, I wonder what if I'm not trying to throw this on media in some sort of bad framing, but if media attention were given to the amount of expenditure that we have on South Korea, how many troops are there, how much, what percentage of GDP or the national budget, defense budget goes into supporting troops there, would American society sour on having troops in that location? I think it's partly, everyone's busy, everyone's trying to do their day job. You only see to some degree what's going on the global level when it's not your job to literally be abreast on those sorts of things, right? That's a very privileged position that we enjoy. I think there are plenty of people that aren't even, they're not thinking about this misalignment, I guess, partly because they genuinely don't even know about it. It's completely off their radar.
Yeah.
So,
well, looks like we're almost out of time. So what I think we'll do is we'll read these last three questions and we'll do kind of a summary here. So the third to last question, can you speak to the ways in which a U.S. military presence itself serves as a radicalizing force for some individuals in the regions we've occupied? Great question. What obligations should we have to Afghans who aided the U.S. over the past 2 decades? Have discussions about these kinds of obligations changed in the time between the withdrawal from Iraq and the withdrawal from Afghanistan? That's a great question too. And what do you believe the long-term impact will be of these withdrawals in terms of American soft power around the world? By the way, before we answer these questions, these are fantastic, really smart, all of these questions that we've gotten. So thank you for, really making us think about our subject today. Do you want to start on some of these?
Sure. Let's see. Let me jump in on obligations to those who have helped us. Frankly, I think that actually ties right into the last one, so I'm going to lump those two together. They pair well. The world's going to remember what we do. History matters. So when the world sees, if we do not take care of our translators, our allies, if we're not looking out for them, whether that means welcoming them to the United States and offering them citizenship or taking care of them in other ways, what happens the next time there's a conflict, the next time the United States says we need help? People will know that they can't rely on the United States. And that feeds right into that last question. What does that do to soft power? I think less of a concern than the idea of America having a quote unquote, loss chalked up on its record here is going to be, how do we handle that loss? Because soft power is partly about your reputation and how you can be perceived as being a moral force or someone who's going to take care of their allies after the fact. So the way that we handle this withdrawal is absolutely paramount in terms of what our soft power is going to be in decades to come.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with Dr. Jackson more. We will we will feel the effects of this for generations. And when we do ask our next partner or our next ally to stand by us, especially when they're going to bear the largest brunt of it, we can expect there to be resistance and doubt as to whether we're going to be able to fulfill our responsibilities. So I think all that's really important. It certainly, I think, helps our competitors too, like the Chinese, who could be seen as a more reliable ally given their system and how it's set up. I did want to talk about that other question too, which is the radicalizing question. Look, we all know that detention facilities have been centers where people have radicalized. Of course, al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, or the original leader of ISIS, was kind of brought up into this environment in a U.S. detention facility in Iraq. So it definitely has that kind of force. We have to remember, and this is why what we were talking about earlier, you cannot kill yourself out of these conflicts. You have to try to enlist the population to take this, on their own, right? It has to be their fight as well. They have to want it. They have to want the outcome that you're trying to achieve. And so that's the counterinsurgency idea, which is, look, what we want here is stability. And if we want stability, the thing that we have to do is make the civilian population support that and fight for it themselves. And we're supporting that. If we're just making enemies by, killing civilians, by, doing raids on houses in the middle of the night, these are the kinds of things that cause problems, by lumping thousands of people together, like, bad actors, together in one common facility and allowing them to kind of network and train. These are things that are not in our strategic interest down the road, and they will have negative impacts. And that affects, the ethical and moral space that we're trying to deliver on as well.
Only thing I'll add, great answer from Professor Vogel. There are different theories on, radicalization, where it comes from. I'll tell you, I come from the economic perspective. I do not believe at all in my study of Islam or the data that the religion has some sort of greater likelihood of inculcating radicalism than any other faith. You want to really nip radicalism. You address the economic factors. So many of those that are fighting for radical groups are not actually all that radical themselves. They've been told that if they die in battle, that their siblings or their parents will be taken care of. And right now, their siblings or parents are already starving in dire conditions. So what they hear is that they're a gun for hire. And I think that's often lost on the narrative, because, of course, we do hear in the media and we see slick videos that come out from ISIS that include an American, a Canadian, an Australian who's actually middle class to upper class, who did radicalize and made the trip to Turkey. Because frankly, that's a lot more interesting and gets more clicks than talking about 5,000 young teenage boys, or in their 20s, who are simply seeing this as their only economic means to ensure their family eats, is picking up a gun for ISIS. So if you really want to take the head off the serpent, in my opinion, we should be thinking more about Marshall Plan Part 2 in some of these nations, and how we get these regions on their feet. Radicalization is the greatest threat is frankly the internet. If we're talking about people who aren't just acting in order to get their day-to-day going, that's where you get the more outlandish stories. And that's where we see radicalization happening far beyond Islam around the world, where people can be radicalized on an isolationist basis. So if you really want to cut down where we actually have large groups that can swath together, you need the economic stability that has people, not in such a desperate state that they will either buy into ideas that should feel and seem outlandish, or even if they don't buy into the ideas, they're willing to do it because, damn it, their kid's sister needs to eat.
Yeah. I'll add one more thing to that too, because I think it is kind of the bigger picture. Economic stability provides a position of hope. People have to have hope. They have to have purpose. They have to have meaning. The other thing that we've seen draws people into radicalism is a sense of purpose, right? A sense of accomplishment, that they're doing something, and that's less likely to happen in a stable, prosperous, environment where you can distinguish yourself through innovation and entrepreneurship and other things aside from, killing yourself in battle or something that, that is used as a tool to, to motivate young people, especially into things that they would never think of in the years before that. So I think that's all we have time. Let's see. Yep.
We've just been told to shut up.
Yeah.
Very, very
got
politely.
The cane off of it. Yeah. No, we want to thank the Ethics Center, Dr. Birch, and all of his staff for having us on. We love doing this event every year. Hopefully we've, had a great discussion that has meant something for all of you. Again, thank you for all the great questions. It's been really fun to just kind of wade through these issues. And if anybody has any follow-up questions, we're always here at the UVU Center for National Security Studies to help you answer those questions. Thank you.
See ya.